the first Great Awakening in America had like a profound effect on the way Americans talked to other Americans, on the way that American colonies got set up, on the things that they had in common and the things that they had that were differences. But in order to understand that, you have to go back to Europe and see where it starts, where the first Great Awakening actually starts. And in order to understand that, you have to understand one thing about the Anglican Church, and that one thing is box pews. These are box pews. Do y'all know what box pews are? They're literally, I don't know if you can see it, but they're literally pews that have little doors to them, like little gates that open and close. Okay, if you have a church with a box pew in it, chances are that your pew is reserved for your family, that you have paid the church in order to have a pew for your family, and that pew has been in your family for several generations, and that if you don't occupy your box pew, nobody else will either, because it's your pew. Okay, what do you think, what kind of effect do you think this has on the church? The fact that the good seats, now there are gallery seats up here, I don't know if you can see it, but up here is a balcony, and up here in the balcony are just pews sitting in a row, just like you would experience in a normal church setting. But what effect do you think it has on the way that churchgoers think? Yes, Joseph.
It seems to be unwelcoming to like new people, and kind of like sticks to like the
new people. Why would new people ever show up in a church? My goodness. Yes. Yeah, well, then they're going to have to work their way in slowly over time and be introduced in order to, and they might as well sit up in the balcony in the meantime. So who does get to sit in the box pews? Who gets to sit in the box pews? Right, the nobles, the wealthy, the people who can afford to. So what happens to the people who can't afford to? What happens to the people who can't afford a box pew? And so they sit up in the balcony where they're visible to all the people from the box pews who can see them up there. So if you are a poor mine worker, what is the likelihood that you're going to attend church at all? Very, very slim, right? You're probably not going to. Chances are that church is going to be a social event that happens on Sundays where people gather and rich families intermingle with each other and then show that they showed up. A lot of times only one person from a family will show up just to make sure that everybody sees that the pew is occupied, but the whole family doesn't have to go because it's not that important. The important thing is that you show up, you shake the hands of the other people that are rich in your class, you see the people in the balcony and judge them, and that's the hierarchy of the church. So the people who are making decisions for the whole community are the people who can afford box pews. What does that have to do with Christianity as a message? What does that have to do with the work of the church? Very little, right? It's mostly just a social club, okay? But box pew mentality is a result of the fact that the Anglican Church didn't have its own beliefs when it started. It just wanted to not be Catholic. It wanted the king to be the head of the church instead of the Pope, and then the Puritans got into it, and it just wanted to not be Catholic, but it didn't have its own development of denomination for a long time. So box pews, that box pew mentality, in the middle of that is where John Wesley was born. Now, John Wesley was the son of an Anglican priest who wasn't very popular. He wasn't well liked by his congregation. He had some problems. He talked too much. He was loud and obnoxious, and he made enemies really easily. And he had problems with money not going the way that he expected it to. So he got accused a couple of times of the church money not going where people expected it to go. So he wasn't. His mother, along with his 14 other siblings. He was educated by his mother, who was an incredibly smart lady named Susanna Wesley. He and his brother were the two youngest of these 15 siblings. And when he was about 4 years old, he almost died in a fire. And they thought he had died. They had evacuated the house while the house was burning down. They looked up and realized that John was still in the window of the nursery, and there was no way to get to him. So they just knelt on the ground and started praying for his soul. And then the people from the village gathered and made a human ladder up to rescue John Wesley from the fire. And his mother saw that and went, "Oh, you're supposed to be a minister because you've been rescued from the fire like an ancient prophecy or something like that." So he went into the ministry for a number of reasons. One was it was his father's business, and one was his mother's absolute faith that that was where he belonged. The truth is, he really did want to be a minister. He was fascinated by all things religious, but he was very disappointed with the way that the ministry was going because his other clergy members were basically there to serve the rich. They were there to tell the rich what they wanted to hear, make church pretty pleasant on Sunday morning, and then leave well enough alone. And he didn't believe that was right. So he and his brother, who was also very dissatisfied with the church, when they went and studied at Oxford, they started a club. That club was called the Holy Club. And they gathered other people that were like them, that were dissatisfied with the clergy and how spiritual it was. And they made them go through all of these steps every single day. They scheduled prayer times and scripture study times. They scheduled mission work. They went out to the orphanages and the soup kitchens, and they actually did mission work. And every day they asked each other 22 questions to hold each other accountable. They were so regimented in the way that they did this, that they believed that if they did this, they would be the best ministers they could be, and they would be like super saved, that their other classmates began making fun of them for having such a strong method to everything that they did. They made fun of them and mocked them and called them Methodists. And that is how the Methodists got started. The Holy Club basically grabbed onto that nickname and held onto it and was like, sure, that sounds good. But that was originally, it was meant to be a way to make fun of them because they were so sure that if they followed all of these steps, they would be in the best possible position to be among the elect. Here are some of the questions, the 22 questions. Can y'all make these out at all? These are the 22 questions that the Holy Club asked each other every single day and expected a good answer to every single day. A little bit. Did any of them jump out to you as like, well, that's just ludicrous? Can I be trusted? Any of them jump out at you as like, do I grumble or complain constantly? Because if your answer to that question is yes, well, then you need to do some work. So these are the questions that the Holy Club asked themselves every single day. They asked each other, all the members asked each other all of these questions every single day. Okay? So they were very, very serious about what they did. In 1732, a young upstart teenager joined the Holy Club at Oxford. His name was George Whitefield. Now, George Whitefield was a fanboy of the club. I want to make sure that you get that before he joined, he was like their biggest fan. He was the little kid that was following around them in Oxford and hoping that they would let him in. He was so enthusiastic about what they were doing that eventually he took it over. Okay? He was more enthusiastic about what they were doing than John and Charles Wesley, who founded it. So he was like the ultimate fanboy of this club. And that was George Whitefield. And we're going to come back and talk about George Whitefield in a little while. In 1735, John got his first assignment in America as a minister. He got appointed to travel to a colony in Georgia. And he was so excited to be going to Georgia because, you see, he expected that when he landed in the American colonies, this is what he would be doing. He would be bringing Christ to the Christless and talking to the Native Americans and being a real missionary for a change. And he was bringing all of that Holy Club zeal with him when he went. He was expecting to be making a real difference when he got to America. Unlike England, which was full of box pews, he was going to get to America and everything was going to be different. Anybody want to guess what he found when he got to Georgia? Box pews. That's right. When he landed in the colony in Georgia, he realized that the place in Georgia had been basically made to be identical to most of the towns in England. That they built churches, and the churches had box pews in them, and that those box pews went to the wealthy plantation owners and the larger, farm owners, and that the peasants, the workers, the slaves and the workers were not really allowed to sit down with the rest of the congregation, and the Native Americans were basically nowhere to be seen because they weren't close enough to the frontier to even really interact with them anymore. It was a town just like any town in England, any city in England, that was a colony in Georgia. So he was expected as the new minister for this colony to take on the same role that all the ministers in the towns in England did. You tell the rich basically what they want to hear. You don't make church too unpleasant. Then you stand out of the way while they make all the decisions, and you smile and nod like a good minister. While the church elders, who also happen to be the landowners, make all the decisions and serve all the offices. And thank you so much for coming. And no, please don't talk to us about our salvation or our sins or anything like that. We don't want to hear it. So that's what he found when he got to Georgia.
Not to mention Charles.
That's a separate issue, and I'm not going to talk about that right now.
Ooh.
Now, in 1737, Wesley had a little bit of an altercation. He had fallen in love with and then proposed to a young woman named Sophia Hopke. She had declined to marry him on the grounds that she had been long promised to somebody else. So she was like, sorry, I would marry you if I could, but I can't because ever since I was young, I was promised to marry this other guy. So I can't marry you. And then she showed up for church to receive communion with her new husband, who was somebody else entirely. So she turned him down because she was promised to somebody else, but she managed to marry somebody else despite that, which means she probably lied to him about being promised to somebody else. Either way, when she showed up for communion with her new husband, who was definitely not the guy that he got turned down for, he responded in an emotional manner and refused to serve her communion. Okay, the problem was that she was part of the Box Pew Society, which means that her uncle was actually the magistrate judge of the colony. So she had a warrant sworn out for his arrest. So he had to flee in the middle of the night and flee back to England. And that was his entire service in America. That was the only time he was ever here. And that's all he did was fail, basically. He showed up with an expectation. It didn't work out. He had a warrant sworn out for his arrest and had to flee back to England. So he arrived back in England feeling like a complete and total failure. And in order to kind of understand what that means to somebody in John Wesley's position, you have to understand something about the elect. Now, Calvin had infiltrated the Anglican Church. So Calvinism, and one of the things about Calvinism is that they believe in predestination. God already knows who's going to be saved. And who those people are called the elect. And you can kind of tell when somebody is one of the elect because of the way they serve, because the things they try work, because they are successful in their ministry, because they seem very full of the Spirit. You can see all those things in one of the elect. There's no doubt in somebody who's one of the elect. And you always go into ministry as an Anglican priest, at least, you're supposed to, with the idea that you must be one of the elect. Otherwise, God wouldn't let you be a minister. And if you're not one of the elect, you're not going to go to heaven, period. No matter how good a life you lead, you're not going to go to heaven. That was an idea that had filtered down through Calvin into the Anglican Church. So Wesley believed it. When his entire first ministry experience in Georgia failed, he went back to England, pretty sure he was not one of the elect. And what do you do with that information? No matter how good you live the rest of your life, you're not going to heaven. What do you do with that information as a minister? So he returned to England completely distraught by what had happened in Georgia. And then one day, he went with his brother to hear a speaker in Aldersgate, which was in London, in Aldersgate. And all they were going to do was go and listen to a reading of the book of Romans. And they were reading the preview, the prologue to the book of Romans. And in the middle of it, suddenly, about 9:15, while he was describing the change which God works in the heart through the faith in Christ, I felt my heart strangely warmed. I felt I did trust in Christ, and on an assurance was given me that he had taken away my sins and saved me from the law of sin and death. Now, this seems like a small thing, but it was such a huge spiritual experience for John Wesley that he turned around with that sudden realization that you can have salvation even if you were not one of, maybe there isn't an elect. Maybe that's not how any of this works. That he turned around and started this ministry of preaching. He was a completely different preacher from then on. And he began to spread that message in England. This is the beginning of the awakening, okay? This is where it starts, with this message of absolute salvation is possible for everybody and definitely possible for you. And all of the personal relationship with Christ stuff comes from this, okay? So let's talk about what was going on back in America. Let's talk about Jonathan Edwards for a minute. The other side of this coin. Y'all, any Hamilton fans in here? Y'all know this, the line in where Aaron Burr says, my grandfather was a fire and brimstone preacher? No Hamilton fans in here. Okay. Yeah, okay. Anyway, Aaron Burr's grandfather was Jonathan Edwards. So Jonathan Edwards had a completely different message that he wanted to spread to the colonies. And part of the reason for that was because he was born in a very different environment than the Wesleys. He was born into a family of Puritans with strong congregational teachings. Come on, let me into my notes. What's the matter with you? All right, well, anyway. His message was that everybody is standing right on the edge of condemnation at all times, and all it would take would be for God to go blink and you would fall into hell. And he wants the colonists to know that, because if they don't know that, then they're not living every day in fear. Then they might sin, and then they, cause problems not just for themselves, but for the people around them. So everybody needs to live in the constant idea, it is nothing but the mere pleasure of God that keeps the arrow one moment from being made drunk with your blood. The arrow being, aimed right at you at all times. So he moved across New England and preached this incredibly difficult message for about 4 years. In 1735, several of his members committed suicide out of fear and despair, and he lost his job. We'll come back to him. Okay. In 1738, George Whitefield showed up in America. That was that fanboy from the Holy Club from before. You remember him? Well, what he had been doing in England was that he had decided that the solution to this box P mentality was to take church outside. So he had been going into the open air and standing out where workers were, like out on the outsides of mines and on the outsides of factories, and doing open air preaching, which was against the rules in the Anglican Church. You weren't really allowed to do that as a minister. You were only allowed to preach inside the building you were appointed to. But George Whitefield didn't care. When Wesley came back and had his big spiritual experience, George said, that's so cool, you should try this. And so John Wesley began to do open air preaching. So when George Whitefield showed up in America, that was where he started. He had a tour through Georgia, through some of the same areas that Wesley worked in, but he immediately jumped outside of his church and outside of his church environment and led revivals out in the open air. And as a result, he ended up preaching to crowds of thousands. He ended up preaching to people from all walks of life and in thousands. Now, I don't want you to get the wrong idea about George Whitefield. This was a man who was, let me see, do I have his actual height in here? He was like 5'3" and just a stubby little guy, and he was really hideously cross-eyed. And when he talked like this, as far as we remember, as far as people, witnessing his preaching. There was nothing about him that would have screamed, this is a man who everybody is flocking to see, and it's easy to be a fan of this guy. He wasn't a handsome man. He wasn't right. He didn't have the swooping hair and the, $1,000 suit. He was just out there with a lot of enthusiasm preaching, but for some reason, that message made it to crowds of thousands. The document that I asked you to read for today is actually a description. And let me get into it real quick. Okay, is actually a description of how Ben Franklin saw George Whitefield. Okay, so did y'all get a chance to take a look at that at all? Let's see, let's pull it up, shall we? Okay, let me get into it. Okay, all right, I'm not going to spoil it for you because part of your assignment is to answer this question. What was the weird thing that he did? That Ben Franklin, who was himself a deist, he didn't believe in, the Anglican idea of God. He was borderline agnostic. He almost didn't believe in anything. But he believed in something out there, but really he didn't have any real religious beliefs. But he is going to describe here what it was like to go and hear Mr. Whitefield preach. What it was, he went with the expectation that he would be baffled, disappointed, confused by what all these crowds were about. And then he ends up doing something sort of startling that even surprises himself. So make sure to take a look at this document when you get the chance, because that's your actual question for today. Okay. So George Whitefield met Jonathan. Yeah, this is a better picture of George Whitefield here. Isn't that great? They're so like, how do you paint a portrait of him without painting the fact that he was really badly cross-eyed? But that wasn't the same as it is today. Like when somebody's cross-eyed today, we think of them as ridiculous. When somebody was cross-eyed back then, they thought of him as, well, he's thinking really, really hard all the time about something. So you thought of them as people of wisdom. So George Whitefield met Jonathan Edwards and met the Presbyterian revivalist that was moving through the area at the time, Gilbert Tennant. And as a result of hearing him preach, and then their messages changed. Jonathan Edwards' messages got harsher, and Gilbert Tennant's messages went further out into the frontiers as a result of hearing him speak at these revivals. In 1742, he finished his tour of America and returned to England, and by then word had gotten around in England, and so George Whitefield found himself preaching to crowds of 30,000, 40,000 people. And have you ever been in a crowd that big? I think maybe there's been like a football game I was at. It was like a major state playoff game. My high school team actually made it to the state playoffs once ever, and then the Longview Lobos took us down. I'm still bitter. I know, we've talked. Anyway, it was a long time ago. It was in the 90s. But I think that was a stadium with the capacity for that big of a crowd. But of course, it didn't have that many people in it. But without stadium seating, we're talking about crowds of 30,000 people. So, yeah. Okay. So the second time he returned to a post. He just returned and began preaching in revivals, and he never had a church. Hold on one second. I have a. Okay. I have a live mic somewhere in my Zoom. Okay, on this tour is where he met Ben Franklin. So that letter that I had you read, that I'm having you read, this is where that happened. It was on his second tour through when he was already wildly popular, crowds of tens of thousands of people. And the message that he had that was so, okay, yeah, all right, so this is where that letter actually went. From being thoughtless or indifferent about religion, it seemed as if all the world were growing religious, so that one could not walk through the town in an evening without hearing psalms being sung in different families of every street. People are getting so religious. So in all of the colonies, across the colonies. Now, Whitefield and Wesley disagreed on some things. Even though Whitefield started out as a big fanboy of the Wesleys, ultimately, as they grow in their ministry, they disagree on some pretty fundamental things. One of them is predestination. Whitefield still believes in the elect. He still believes in that. But partly, he believes he's definitely one of them. And I mean, all you have to do is look at the crowds of 10,000s to agree with him. And second, he believes that the elect is not reflected in your wealth. So anybody could be one of the elect, and you wouldn't know it just by looking at them. And that makes his message incredibly popular, because the elect could be any, it's not just the plantation owners, it could be any of the people that work on that plantation could also be one of the elect, and you wouldn't know it. As a matter of fact, and this is crazy, could be one of the slaves that's one of the elect. And that message takes off and goes in its own direction. Like the idea that, yes, okay, there's an elect and God already knows exactly who's going to be saved and there's no way to work up to it. But, oh my gosh, it could be you. You could be one of those winners. Okay, so Wesley at this point believes there is no elect, that salvation is something that's available for everybody. And that's also an incredibly popular message to the people who don't feel like they're part of that community. But they disagree on that, but at the same time, their message kind of comes across the same way. Like it still could be you that ends up in heaven. So that's the ultimate message that they have. They disagree on the idea of perfection. Whitefield believed that perfection came at the moment that you're saved, and then you can backslide. How many of y'all belonged to a church where that was something that you were taught? that you're baptized and you're made whole and you're made good, but you can backslide. No? Nobody in this class? Okay, it's a Baptist belief, and a lot of Baptist churches believe that. And Church of Christ believes that in the moment that you're saved, that's a moment where you are, your soul is made right and perfect with God, and then you can backslide. Wesley believed that perfection is the beginning, that the moment you're saved is the beginning of a process by which you are perfected, and that you are only perfected at the end of your life. So the moment you're saved is the moment you start walking down that road towards perfection. And because of that, they have this fundamental disagreement on what happens when you're baptized, which caused problems in their revivals. Because somebody who was baptized is like, I'm officially free of sin. And Wesley would have said, no, you're not, but you're headed in the right direction. And Whitefield would have said, yes, you are, so hold on to it. And they disagreed when that message got out and began to spread beyond them. The last big thing that they disagreed on was the idea of slavery. Whitefield believed that good masters could own slaves, that your responsibility as a slave owner was to be good to your slaves, to treat them with respect and to not be cruel to them. Wesley didn't believe that anybody good could own slaves. And they have this argument in public. They have this argument in published letters back and forth to each other that other people read and other people argue over. Wesley makes a really ridiculously large case for exactly why. I mean, he writes a whole book on slavery and why there is no upside to slavery. There's no good Christian practice that allows you to keep slaves. Whitefield believed that slavery was a part of the natural society of life, but that cruel masters were a bad thing. So you can only be a good master, you can only be a Christian and be a good master and own slaves. Depending on which one was popular where, depending on which message the local people grabbed onto. But permission from Whitefield to own slaves is a big part of the split that happens later. Because Wesley's followers, remember Wesley is back in England, but he's sending people to America to preach his message, mostly filter into New England and the North. Whitefield's popularity starts in Georgia and spreads north from the South. So that's kind of a big deal. But whether they agreed or not with each other, whether they fought, and sometimes it was pretty vitriolic. When Whitefield died, which was much, much sooner than when Wesley died, Wesley preached at his funeral, offered the message at his funeral, and said that they had agreed to disagree on a lot of things, but that they were both still servants of the same God, and all that stuff. So after Whitefield's death, here's what happened to his associates. Jonathan Edwards left preaching in disgrace in 1751 after several members of his congregation committed suicide, and he was just found to be too harsh for the message that was taking off, because his message was nobody is going to be saved except, people who don't teeter into the brink. So he returned in 1752, he returned to England, and he found out that he had a fan base. There were crowds of 10,000s of people who were hardcore Calvinists who believed that he was the one with the one true message. So he found out that he had a huge fan base in England. And he left behind his family in America, and one member of that family was Aaron Burr, but that's beside the point. The Gilbert Tennant, who was Presbyterian, led congregations all the way down to the colonies and actually caused a schism in the Presbyterian church. So you have several different Presbyterian churches as a result of Gilbert Tennant's revivals. But those schisms in 1758, they begin to come back together and negotiate the reunification of the Presbyterians. And in case you don't know, the Presbyterians are basically the Scottish church. They're Calvinists who went to Scotland. So, come on, go. Next slide, thank you. Meanwhile, the Methodists. Okay, Wesley preached all over England and all over Scotland, and his followers, the people that heard him preach and followed him and learned from him, came to America and set up groups inside the Anglican churches in America. Now, it's important to recognize they didn't set up a new church. What they set up were special Sunday school classes inside churches that already existed. So the Methodists were not a separate denomination when they were formed. They were a Sunday school class inside the Anglican church. Does anybody know what the American version of the Anglican church is? Some of you might be it and not even know it. Do you know? Go ahead. The Episcopalians. No? No Episcopalians, huh? Okay, well, we have a pretty big Episcopalian congregation in Texarkana. It's St. James Episcopal Church. Yeah, it's downtown. They have a big school and stuff. But the reason that there is an Episcopal church, the reason there are Episcopalians is because something happened in 1776 and all the Anglican ministers left and went back to England. Anybody remember what happened in 1776 that caused Anglican ministers to leave and go back to England? Can't recall anything happening in 1776 that would make English ministers leave and go to England and leave America? The revolution. Yeah, I heard you. The revolution happened, and as a result of the revolution, many Anglican ministers left. And since the head of the Anglican church is who? Remind me who the head of the Anglican church is? The King of England. What was left behind couldn't be called Anglican anymore. So it becomes either the Episcopalians or establish their own churches. And now they have their own denomination. Before that, that's not who they were. They were a Sunday school class inside. But by that point, they've spread so much that there are Methodist groups inside almost every major town in the colonies. So when in 1776, when the revolution happens, those just become churches, and the Methodist church becomes the most widespread Protestant church in the colonies, just like that. The pesky Methodists. And that's what they're actually called in some of the literature, the pesky Methodists, because they're loud and they sing a lot and they're noisy, which I don't know if you've ever been to a Methodist church, but that's an old thing. That's not a current thing. Methodists are like, we don't raise our hands or anything. We're actually very quiet. So what happens as a result of these revivals moving through the colonies is that new congregations get created inside colonies that already exist. And those congregations are mixed classes, so the wealthy and the poor, all working together. They are mixed origins, so people from Germany and people from England and people from Spain and France are all worshiping together. And it empowers individuals. The new revival messages empower individuals because either you have Whitefield telling you that even the poorest person among you could be one of the elect, or you have Wesley's people telling you that salvation is available for everybody, or any of their followers in any iteration of that message. In either way, each individual member of a church has value. So each individual has value, which is an American concept, isn't it? One person, one vote, all that kind of stuff. Another thing that happened is that slaves took this message and made it their own. Slaves began to actually share this message with one another that they had heard at the revival, which they attended with their masters. They would come back and they would share what they heard, and they'd play a little bit of a game of telephone with it. So you would attend in order to, so if you were like, a house slave who was attending with the daughter of the plantation owner, then you would come back and you would tell the other slaves what you think you heard, and then they would take that message and talk about it and cook it a little bit, and then what would end up with is a completely different, not completely different, but a slightly different message. So slave Christianity begins to rise during this time. The congregations are incredibly diverse, and because of the message being such a positive message, the fear of what comes next, the afterlife in this, brutish and nasty existence that is the colonies, begins to diminish, and people begin to feel individually more confident about their lives. So what happens if you have, in the space of 20 years, and a revival that takes from about the 1730s to about the 1750s, when you turn an entire population of colonists from terrified, old world, loyal to their church, respectful of the classes, dividing themselves by wealth, into an entire colony of people that are in diverse congregations that all believe in their own individual worth.
You get millennials.
I don't know, maybe that's what happened. You get Americans. You get a new kind of people, and that kind of people is separate from Europe. They are colonists in America become different from the residents of Europe as a result of these revivals. Okay, so Meeting George Whitefield had an unexpected effect on Benjamin Franklin. According to the document you read, write a short paragraph describing what Benjamin Franklin did that he was not expecting to do. And what does that mean about Whitefield's influence? Okay, any questions about any of that stuff? Any of the Great Awakening stuff? Now, this is the first Great Awakening in America. There's going to be a second one. And that one is going to be very, very different from the first one. It's the second Great Awakening that gives us things like the Mormons. Okay, the Transcendentalists. Okay, that's the second Great Awakening. And that happens about 100 years later. This is the first Great Awakening. So, so what do y'all think? Do you feel like church in America is different from church in other places in the world because of things like the revivalist wave that came through? Yeah, I mean, I do, obviously, in my other profession. I feel the effects of being able to tell somebody individually you have worth and individually you have, you know, all this relationship with the divine and all of that kind of stuff. I grew up Catholic, so I was also attached to a completely different denomination, and I am not Catholic any longer. I'm not saying Catholics are wrong, but I'm just not one of them. But so I kind of feel that the church in America has a very, but if you talk to people from the Catholic Church in America and talk to people from the Catholic Church in Europe, they're like, Americans are weird. They think American Catholics are super weird. And part of the reason for that is that cut off thing. It grew as its own thing. So, all right, so any questions?